Hi, everybody. I'm Edie Stern. I'm the webmaster for fanac.org. Very happy today to introduce our panel on Death Does Not Release You, LASFS Through the Years. And I'm going to let our moderator, Craig Miller, introduce the panel, and I'll see you all later.
Thank you, Edie. Hi, everyone. As you said, I'm Craig Miller, and she asked me to moderate the panel. In typical fanish style, I have no prepared introductions for everybody. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves and start with how they found out about LASFS and when they joined, and just do a couple minutes about that, or however long they want to take. And I'm going to actually start with Ken, who joined first. All of us.
I guess I did. I'm probably the oldest one on this panel. I'm 80 and a half years tomorrow. I mean, only kids measure their years by half years, but when you get to my age, you never know when it's going to end. So I'm prepared. In any case, I want to go back to why I got involved with fandom when I was 8 years old, and only peripherally. It took me all the years until 1966 or so before I found LASFS in order to attend it, even though I knew about it a lot earlier. And I'd like to go back to when I was 8 years old and I was given Heinlein's current juvenile, which was Space Cadet. I'm not making that bell noise, am I? No. Okay.
I don't know where that noise is coming from.
Okay. So Space Cadet when I was 8 years old, and it just fit into my world. And then I found quickly his first book, which was Rocket Ship Galileo, and read that. And then every year I managed to acquire every single new one through high school. I mean, the next one was to Mars, and then he went to Ganymede, and then he went to Venus. And it just took me through that period of my life. I would always then, when the new one came out, I'd reread all the old ones. And so it just was, and then of course I branched out and became more interested in grown-up Heinlein books, and eventually Van Vogt and Asimov and all of the masters. But I do want to talk about the first time that I encountered fandom, which was when I was 10. I was living in Carthay Circle, and it turned out that I heard a rumor that this guy had the world's biggest collection of science fiction books in my area. I mean, it was a little bit, it was across San Vicente from where I was, and it was a little bit towards the north, but it turns out that this was Forey Ackerman, at least when he lived in this particular house. And his science fiction collection was all in his garage. And it was stacks and stacks of bookcases. And I managed to inveigle myself an invitation at 10 years old to visit his house and be shown his collection. And of course, that just cemented my interest in science fiction and fandom, although I was really one of those very shy children. It doesn't sound it because I managed to find Forey back at that age, but I was backwards socially, as a lot of fans were. And the next contact, well, I did start reading Analog, which was then Astounding, and they had a great letter call, which really contained a lot of information about fandom, including the 1958 Worldcon that was held in LA called Solicon. It was Southgate in '58. I was a junior in high school, and I had a car, and I knew about it. I knew it was going to be in September of, before school started in September of '58. And I knew where Southgate was, but I actually was too shy. I just couldn't myself go. And it's been a lifetime of regret, because if I had managed to go to Silicon in '58, I would have met all these people years before they became my friends or people that I actually knew. And so I'm sorry about that, but my actual
We forgive you.
Yeah. Wait, say it again.
We forgive you.
Oh, thank you. Well, I don't forgive myself. It's like there are certain regrets that you have in life, and that was a major one. And I regretted that I missed out on Silicon. It wasn't really until '66 or so that I'm not even sure how I decided finally to go to LASFS meeting. I was out of college by then, just barely, and I was working. In a studio nearby in Hollywood, and somehow or other, I was convinced to go to the. I convinced myself to try LASFS, to go to the first meeting. The meeting was in a recreation house at just south of the Silver Lake. I guess you'd say the reservoir in the Silver Lake area. And I had a car. I mean, I was basically an adult by then. And my first meeting, I really felt at home. The president at the time was Flieg, the Fliegender Hollander, Fred Hollander. And I remember that character, but and I was really like jazzed by their one big activity that really interested me, was publishing a little weekly fanzine for APL, which was the distribution that happened at every meeting. And so I was determined the next week to start contributing to APL. And I didn't have a Mimeo or any kind of thing like that. So I did have a Xerox machine in my office, and so I was able to use that to Xerox enough copies of it. And my zine was called Grok. I'm not sure you can even see it. Unfortunately, I've got this weird. Anyway, it doesn't matter. And by the time I'm going to read, I just want to finish this intro by reading something from my 31st Grok composition, which was in November of '67, because in it, I really discuss the meetings and what was going on with LASFS at the time. And I think that a contemporary point of view of what it was like then, it's worth the little time. I'm just going to read excerpts, won't take long. I'm going to try and do it without I have new eyes because I just this year had cataract surgery. So I could put on my reading glasses, but I don't think I need them. All right. This is from the November 30th, '67 APL distribution 163, LASFS meeting 1,581. Now that's sort of significant. Almost 1,600 LASFS meetings had already happened by the time that I wrote this 31st APL thing. Whence goest thou, fandom? APL, the venerable LASFS. The past couple of distributions have been full of all sorts of disturbing portents. First came Don Fitch's woeful eulogy of fandom that was. Then the startling realization that APL was wilting before our very eyes after the Anish. I do have a copy of the Anish, which had this wonderful pictorial cover that was published. Maybe all those things. I actually wrote this one. There are pictures of people like Bruce Pelz and Diane Pelz naked over there as part of the cover or whatever. Anyway, Then the startling realization that Apple was wilting before our very eyes. After the Anish, rampant apathy, lower page counts, lost contributors, lack of new blood. Well, I'm not so sure that was true for long, because that's about the time that the LASFS people from the Valley came around in late 67. I never thought I'd see the day when I would miss Al Snyder. He was from that group. Anyway, I don't want to go on with that. I just want to skip to another thing. Finally, there's LASFS. Today's LASFS is a different organization than the one I joined 10 scant months ago. Sure, the meetings are as zany as ever, but it all seems different somehow. Think back, except for the auctions of that crazy rocket ship, what has happened at a meeting in the last month or so that's even worth calling it to order? At least half of the people who come to the Hill, okay, I have to explain that by this time, the meetings were held in a slant shack called the Hill, which had several different fans in living there. What has happened at a meeting in the last month or so that's even worth calling it to order? At least half of the last month or so, wait a second. At least half of the people who come to the Hill on Thursday nights aren't interested in the meetings right now. And even if they were, the meeting room is arranged so badly that I doubt if we could put many more into it. I don't like the seating arrangement. It is bad that most people either have their backs to the rostrum or have to stand or even sit so far out in the hall. I sympathize with the Hill's desire to have an aesthetically pleasing living room. I just don't think that the present milieu is conducive to a good meeting. Okay, that's sort of prelude, because soon thereafter, I had been treasurer for a while of LASFS, and we had been collecting a building fund. And soon thereafter, even though I wasn't around when it actually happened, we used that building fund to get a meeting house in the Valley. And all of a sudden, it was very different. And people who actually were part of LASFS later might be more willing to talk about the LASFS.
Okay. I want to keep going with people's introduction to LASFS. And we'll get back to all that. I think I was the next one to join. Normally, as the moderator, I introduce myself last, but chronologically, it was me. And Edie, our host from fanac.org, asked me to tell this story, so it'll be a little longer than I might have otherwise. But in 1967, I was 13 years old, and I didn't know about science fiction fandom and organized fandom. I was a science fiction reader and a comics fan, and I was doing a fanzine, as were my two cousins, Rob and Jeff. They were doing a fanzine of their own, and we wrote to Ray Bradbury. I lived not far from where Ken was living. He was in Carthay Circle, and I was in Beverlywood. And we wrote to Ray, and he said, sure, we could come talk to him. He could give us half an hour on thus and such a day. And we went to see him, and we ended up with him for 2.5 hours, I think. And coincidentally, 2 weeks ago, I found the reel-to-reel tape in my storage unit of the interview we did with Ray, which, considering we were 12, 13, and 14 years old, I'm sure is just an amazing interview. And as soon as I have someone who has a reel-to-reel recorder, we can play it, I will find out. But anyway, one of the things Ray said was that I should go join LASFS. We should go join LASFS. He said it was the club he belonged to, although he did tell us he didn't attend regularly anymore. And a few weeks later, in late January, I think, of 1968, we went to our first LASFS meeting. at the Hill, which was an old boarding house that now had a lot of fans living in it. So it became a slant shack, one of a series of many that had grown up in LA. And the meetings were there until I think late 68 or 69 when they moved to Tom Digby's apartment. But this was in Mid Wilshire on Berendo, the Hill. Anyway, I went to that. And again, I was 14. And the thing that struck me about LASFS was that no one said, who's that kid? I mean, we were by far the youngest people there. Everyone, there were a couple people who were in college, but most everyone was in their 20s, 30s or older. And they just treated us like everybody else. And it was like, wow, people who not only don't think we're weirdos for liking science fiction, they treat us, I wouldn't say like grown-ups, they treat us like they treated everybody, which was not necessarily like grown-ups. And that, you know, made me want to keep going to LASFS, even though I had to get my mother or someone else to give me a ride back and forth, because at 14, I couldn't drive. And that's how I found LASFS. Tim, I think you were the next one to join.
Yeah, I don't remember the circumstances, to tell you the truth. I think I saw an ad in a fanzine or something. I came to science fiction fandom through Tolkien fandom. And I had done some fan art for Tolkien and things like that. And somehow somebody talked about Lost. And like a lot of students who didn't have any connection, I felt very so as everybody said here, welcome to Lost with open arms. I was probably 20, 19. I was in college at the time. And it was a wonderful experience. I came to Hill first and then to Palm Park. They were in Palm Springs for a while, at the recreation hall or whatever. And by the time they had get in their own clubhouse, I had taken a job back in Kansas City and no longer 10, but I was still interested in going on. But while I was, I continued to tell, pardon?
I'm sorry, we're having some problems with your audio. It's like,
I'm getting feedback. So I'm unmuted. Oh, no.
No, you're not on mute, but it's breaking up in and out. It's.
Can you hear me? No.
I
Yikes.
think you're haunted.
Maybe so. If I need well, I've done a lot of calls.
Whatever you're doing now, it's getting it worse.
I'll just keep
Turn off your mic. Tim, if you'll turn off your mic, if you have a second mic you could try, that would be great. Otherwise, just turn it off and try turning it back on again. And Craig, maybe you want to talk to someone else while he is trying to get his
Okay, Bobbi, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. I guess I'm the redheaded stepchild here in that I didn't discover LASFS or fandom until my mid-20s. You know, I was going along just a kid in Orange County feeling I was the only person in the world who read science fiction. I would pick up on a monthly basis analog and fantasy and science fiction and devour them. And through the magazines and the letter columns, I found out about Locus. I became a subscriber to Locus, and there was this titillating picture of people who enjoyed the same things I did out there. And, so I went along being titillated for, many, many months. And finally, in the convention column, there was a convention in California. It was the WesterCon in 1973 in San Francisco. And God darn, I was going to go. It was my very first airplane ride. It was my very first time in a hotel room. It was my very first time in a taxi. It blew my mind. It was immersion into a culture that I didn't know existed. And during that time, that magical weekend, I met many people, but most importantly, I met Drew Sanders. After the convention, we would talk on the phone. And I lived in Orange County at that time, which is about an hour and a half drive from Los Angeles. And he came down to visit one day, and he met my best friend, whose name is also Bobbi Adair at that time. And they started dating. And my life went this way and her life went that way. And eventually I was divorced, and I could go to LASFS. So Drew took me to LASFS. He introduced me to Bruce. He introduced me to all of the other people there.
That would have been Bruce Pelz.
Bruce Pelz, thank you. Is there another? And my life changed, okay, at that point. And can get into that when we get into how life changes when you hit fandom. Okay, so.
Okay, I see Tim is now in a second box. So do we think maybe he's recovered?
Now, can you hear me now?
Yes, that's much better.
We can't see you right now.
There you are.
Somewhere.
They're working behind the scenes to move Tim back onto the main screen. But Tim, why don't you finish your story?
Yeah, as I said, I think I was originally in Tolkien fandom, early Tolkien fandom in the mid 60s. And somehow I found out that there was something called LASFS. And I don't remember how, but I started coming. I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed participating in APL. I had a kind of a not very nice weekly feature called Harlan Elephant, which was sort of insulting, but I thought in those days, I thought it was brilliant satire. I learned later that it wasn't so brilliant, but otherwise I met a lot of wonderful people. I met Alicia Austin, George Barr, all you folks. I wish I could have continued beyond 1972, but fate took me elsewhere. So, and I'm glad it's still going. I hope you get another clubhouse soon. I did a little research on the history, and I didn't know you'd moved around quite so much. But I don't know, maybe someday I'll be able to attend. I would love to attend again.
Yeah, right now, LASFS is all on Zoom. Just a history. LASFS founded in, it says here, I have a little paperweight that was produced by LASFS in the early 80s. You probably can't see it too well, but it shows the club coat of arms, and it says 27 October 1934 was the founding of LASFS. And around 70, 71, we bought the first clubhouse on Ventura Boulevard in, I guess that's Studio City. And then over the years, we moved to a larger building. Actually, it was a pair of buildings, one behind the other on Burbank Boulevard. Then after a while, the club moved to a location. I think it was on, I think the street was Tyrone. It was a small side street, a little further west. And a few years ago, and I confess, I'm no longer very active with LASFS. I am in contact with a lot of people, and I have been to a couple of the Zoom meetings since the pandemic, but I'm not on regularly. But the club sold the building on Tyrone for a variety of reasons that have been debated at great length since, with the expectation that they'd easily be able to buy another building or find a property and build a building to their desires. And that didn't work out. And so for the last several years, starting before the pandemic, LASFS has been first meeting in rented spaces like churches, just like it did years ago, and now weekly on Zoom. The meetings are much smaller than they were when we had a clubhouse, and the library is in storage along with lots of other stuff. And personally, I think it was a big mistake selling that most recent building without having another place to go to, but I was not regularly attending meetings at that time. And so I wasn't part of the debate, and I don't know all the arguments either way. But in any case, while LASFS had a clubhouse for 40 plus years, I think, it is now currently between clubhouses.
Sad. But I guess inevitable, because it's been going since 1934 or whatever. I mean, you have to go through ups and downs.
Yeah, but you know, the club has been over the years a very important part of my life. I found many of my good friends, some of whom I'm still good friends with today. Bobbi mentioned Bruce Pelz. I want everyone to talk about the people they remember as part of LASFS and why they kept going. But Bruce was chairman of LASFS when I joined. I think Dave Hewlin was treasurer. And, you know, I have to say, Bruce in particular, treating me as another adult in the room was part of what kept me going.
Yeah, it's, you know, LASFS for me, you know, I, again, 73, 74, when we started, all I've known is LASFS with a clubhouse, okay? But it was Bruce who was the nexus, it seemed to me, of the social aspect of LASFS, the parties, the after parties, the, you know, all of that. And that's what LASFS was, at least in my view, it was my social circle. It was my family, for goodness sake. And all of that, you know, all of that revolved around Bruce, okay? And when we lost him, we lost that center of our social circle, okay? And we've been sort of struggling, you know, after that. You know, it was how important is a single person, you know, to an organization.
Well, for sure, he was like the major character in LASFS when I joined up in '66. So I guess he'd been around for a while. He had previously been married to Diane Pelz, and then who left him for Chuck Crane, who became a very good friend of mine. And Chuck, when we started to make the Shangri-La Fairs that ended up getting nominated for a Hugo back in '67, '68, which Tim Kirk obviously had a lot to do with. But Chuck Crane was the one who had the litho printer in his garage. And so it was centered around there, but I guess I was the creative force that sort of made it happen. So Shaggy and what was called by people like Joe, who was a major character and probably still is in her own way, but we were called the Barbarian Invasion, which was different from Valsfa, which also was an invasion of young people, but we were, I think, a little bit older at the time and more drug oriented because I had a very good LSD connection, and a lot of people sort of glommed on to a lifestyle that we were living back in 67, 68. 67 might be a little early, 68. I could discuss that at length, but then the FBI or somebody might come after me or whatever.
I remember a lot. I was too young for that when I was there in 68, 69.
Yeah, but your cousin Robert was not.
No, he was a whole year older than me. But he was much more adventurous in that regard than I ever was.
Yeah. Well, like, for instance, in 68, it was all centered over this sort of slam shack that I and Don Simpson, who was another artist like Tim Kirk, rented this place in West Hollywood. And a lot of us would get together on Friday nights, for instance, to watch the Smothers Brothers. We also, starting at a certain time in 68, would drop acid and go watch 2001. And we had it, I think I counted it. We did it 18 times on acid over the course of 2 years. And we would start out on the Friday night evening performance. And we would drop the acid so that when the bone was thrown up, we would be peaking or whatever. And this first sequence with the apes wasn't that interesting. But by the time we went to outer space and had the final show at the end with the light show, we were like all just totally stoned. And it was great. It was our social activity. We didn't do it every single weekend because we did it like every other weekend because you just couldn't trip every weekend. It was not possible. But that was one of the things that brought us together. And it was also the group that made Shaggy. And if you were to read Shaggy, a lot of the descriptions, maybe we held a little bit back about the drug usage or whatever, but that was why we were called the Barbarians. We were invaded with drugs. And
I remember the joke was that your refrigerator, which contained a rumored 1 million mics of LSD, floated off the floor of your kitchen.
Well, I think that's an exaggeration, sort of, but nevertheless,
Perhaps.
I had my brother-in-law was a major distributor for the entire country of Owsley acid, which came from San Francisco. And one of my things was to drive up to San Francisco to visit my sister who was living there. And it was her husband at the time who was distributing the drugs. And so I had a really good source for Owsley acid, which I had already taken Sandoz earlier before I even got into fandom, because my sister was basically a proto-head, a hippie queen, actually. She ended up being a major mover and shaker in the Grateful Dead fandom, group, and that whole business. Anyway, I don't want to go too far into
Yeah, I think let's move back to LASFS.
Yeah.
Drug
And
culture.
I'm sorry. I could talk about this forever and nobody.
But it seems like there are constant influxes of barbarian hordes. There was your group. A year or two later, there was the Valsfa. Once we moved in 1969, 70 from Tom Digby's apartment to Palms Park in West LA, we started getting a whole bunch more high school age, people my age, There was a whole group called the Gahillions, which were a whole
Right.
group
Mhm.
of people from Granada Hills High who would drive into the West Side for the LASFS meetings. And
Yeah, I would-
there've been a continuous set of barbarian invasions over the years.
All right. I guess the one that I was most involved with is the first time I heard the word barbarian invasion, but now I remember when LASFS showed up, so at least mine came before that.
So I'm just looking at my notes of questions.
Oh, wait, can I bring one
Yeah,
other
yeah,
thing?
yeah.
I wanted to talking about really important things with major people. Every meeting, starting sometime in 68, I believe, after the meeting, around 9 o'clock, we would all get together at Larry Niven's and Fuzzy Pink Livin's house
Mhm.
for LASFS poker. And LASFS poker became a rather big deal. Jerry Purnell, for instance, who was maybe not he was the most outspoken person I ever met, but probably not the most popular, but nevertheless, he was a terrible poker player, as was Larry Niven. So it was like the fish of the group. But nevertheless, that was an important part of LASFS, in my experience, of the sociability of it.
Yeah.
And
I
it's
remember
my
at the Hill, there was a side room on the ground floor that people would break off into to play poker after the meetings.
Yeah, well, I think the Larry Niven group happened after they already moved to the Valley. So
my understanding that the after meetings, which the ones that I'm familiar with, happened in restaurants after the meetings at the clubhouse. But that tradition, okay, as I understand it, started with those poker games, okay,
yeah, well,
after the meetings.
Well, there,
not surprising. It was a big deal. But I mean, you only had about 9 people at a poker table, and we played a series of weird games. I mean, it was dealer's choice. I was very experienced, and actually, I have to say that I was mostly a winner. I mean, whatever.
Was there actually, Ken, was there actually a game of LASFS poker where the rules are that the dealer got to make the rules up as the game went along?
And not in my experience.
Oh, okay, because
but it wouldn't surprise me.
That's a myth that, came down to us youngins.
Well, as Craig said, it wouldn't surprise me, but we were actually sort of serious. There were some weird games like Follow the Queen and stuff like that I don't think even I, who had experience in my dorm at MIT, for instance, of playing a considerable amount of poker all weekend. A lot of the same games got played in the LASFS poker too.
Yeah, going back to Bobby's point, there definitely were restaurant after meetings. I imagine there were at the Hill. I didn't know about them because having to depend on my parents for rides, I had to leave before anything like that. But a couple years later, when I could drive, I know when we were meeting at Digby's, people would go to a restaurant afterwards. And from Palms Park, there were restaurant after meetings and continuing on, well, not today, but as long as LASFS was meeting in person at one restaurant or another. And sometimes there were splinter after meetings.
Yeah.
Our group would go to this restaurant and that group would go to that restaurant. But sometimes there were 20, 30, 40 people going to the after meeting in restaurants. When we had the clubhouses in the Valley, Solly's for a long time was the restaurant of choice.
Yeah.
And then our favorite waitress moved and we followed her to the restaurant she moved to.
Listen, Lenny Bales just put a thing about Cal's, which is where we went to after the Silver Lake stuff. I remember, well, I dropped out in '69 because I moved out of town after breaking up with my ex-wife, and I moved up to the mountains of north of LA. So for 2 years, I didn't attend any meetings. But by the time I came back, it was definitely at the Valley.
Yeah. Okay. I'm looking at the notes I've been given of questions. But let's go back to some of the other people who were there. Bruce was certainly a major portion of everybody's world around LASFS, but who else were centers of LASFS? Who else were among the movers and shakers? I think even the mid 60s, the Trimbles had mostly moved away from LASFS.
They were still powers behind the throne for sure.
That's where I met Bijo. I met
Where I
Bijo.
met Bijo too.
And she was responsible largely for the beginning of my career as an artist with her art shows at the conventions. She was a great advocate for fan art. For me, for George Barr, for Alicia Austin and others. So she made a big difference in my life.
There was Bill Rotzler, who was
Oh, yeah.
definitely, I mean, I think as a cartoonist or whatever, he was unparalleled, in my opinion. He really had a knowledge of fandom and a really fun sense. Plus he was a director of pornos.
Well, Ken, you know that we do a Rotzler Award every year,
I didn't
okay,
know that.
to honor him for fan cartoonists.
Well
Okay.
deserved. I mean,
To keep his name alive.
at his, actually one of my the major trips that I ever took was at his place up in one of the canyons. He had a tent set up and we had this gigantic party and I zoned out for hours, so I don't even remember most of it, but that's okay. Anyway, there were Milt Stevens, for instance. I remember he actually worked in a place across the street from my office back in the 80s or 90s, but I know he was an officer of LASFS when I was there. So he's another one.
You know, they're the Moffats.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. You know,
I remember Len and what's her name? But
June.
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 Yeah, Len and
Yeah.
June.
No, I definitely remember.
The Moffiti, you know, Dan Alderson, Fred Patton, you know.
Oh,
those
Fred
people.
Patton for sure. All of these people were around when I was active. So yes.
Yeah,
Let's understand, you
beyond
always
naming
thought
names, let's
I
talk a
see.
little bit about these people. I mean, we're remembering them, but I think a lot of the people listening to this don't know who they are. So Fred, I think, was a member, but even before you joined, Ken.
Absolutely. And also, yeah, he was an organizer of APL for sure. He made it. He was the driving force behind it.
Yeah, Fred was, professionally, he was a librarian, had an amazing knowledge of books. Fred and I both shared an interest in animation. He later got much more involved with animation from Japan, but he was also a fan of American historic animation. And we used to go to, before the days of video, you used to go to other collectors' homes who would have prints of films, 16mm prints of films, and watch them in their living room. And once a month, Fred and I would go to one of those gatherings and watch animation together.
That's cool. I'd like to talk about Tom Digby, for instance.
Oh,
Apparently,
yeah.
Please.
after I dropped out to go live in Lake Arrowhead, apparently he was the host of LASFS for a while. But in my experience, he was part of what I am going to have to say is sort of like the gay subgroup of LASFS characters. It took a while because a lot of us were like closeted to some degree, and a little bit leery of it, but we knew about each other. And Tom was one of the major characters, along with like David Gerald at the time. And we would get together at, for instance, at the LA Con, at the LA Cons, we would have a surreptitious meeting of the gay LASFS people. And Digby was just a character. I mean, really and truly.
He was one of the people that taught me about thinking, about that it's okay to, barriers. There are no barriers,
Yeah.
There is no such thing as silly or stupid thoughts. Okay. And, that was, again, another major influence on my life. And I'm so sorry that, I came later than the chocolate covered manhole cover stories.
Yeah.
And stuff. So,
Yeah. I remember at a meeting at Tom's house in '69, Tom announced to the meeting, as part of the business part of the LASFS meeting, that he was gay, and he didn't know if that would bother people. And he was the first out as that is, gay person I had ever met. There were closeted gays I had met, but he was the first person I had known who said that. And of course, no one was bothered by it. And Diane,
I'm not so sure, but nevertheless.
well, I'm sure there were, but no one said anything. Diane Crane said, Tom, that's probably the least unusual thing about you.
Yeah, okay, well, it's probably true. I mean, he really was a character, but
He really
talk
was.
about
it
character.
really was. And if you want to know a little more about Tom Digby, and I mentioned chocolate covered manhole covers, which is, what can you say about chocolate covered manhole covers? Is a short story by Larry Niven that fictionalizes the divorce party, okay, of Bruce Pelz and Diane, okay, at which Tom is a star. There you go.
Yeah, he was quite a character and incredibly creative and inventive. He later moved up to the Bay Area, and he's still up there. I think his health is not good these days, but he's still up there. And
As is Don Simpson,
Alan
by
Mann.
the way. And Lenny Bales, who is part of this discussion, because he's adding some comments as we speak. So whatever. I love all these people. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry that a lot of them are gone now. And
Yeah.
I feel glad that I've actually survived, but